For nearly 20 years, almost no one was allowed to see what was really happening inside Royal Lodge. Then inspectors finally walked through the doors. What they found was serious enough to trigger the loss of honours, the collapse of a long-standing lease deal, and a complete reversal of fortune. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the palace stopped negotiating and started erasing. If you want to stay informed on the stories unfolding behind palace walls, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The inspection wasn't routine. In fact, it had been delayed for years. Royal Lodge had remained largely off-limits, protected by long-standing agreements and assumptions that maintenance was being handled privately. But in mid-November, that protection ended. Officials were finally granted full access, and what they documented immediately changed the conversation. The first shock wasn't cosmetic, it was structural. Systems that should have been routinely updated hadn't been. Repairs expected under the lease had been deferred, and suddenly the idea that the estate would be handed back in good condition started to collapse. That alone raised a critical question: how long had these issues been building? Within days, the findings were serious enough to be shared beyond palace walls. A formal letter was sent to members of parliament, something that almost never happens over a private lease. The message was blunt. The property showed significant dilapidations, and returning it to standard would require extensive work. That single sentence carried a much larger implication. Because under the lease terms, compensation depended on condition. If the estate wasn't properly maintained, there would be no payout. And the numbers involved weren't small. For years, estimates suggested an exit worth nearly $500,000. Now that figure was quietly being reduced to zero. And this is where the story takes a turn. The estate didn't just warn that compensation was unlikely, it signaled that responsibility for the damage would become an issue once the keys were returned. Which leads to the next question: what exactly deteriorated so badly that the Crown estate was forced to step in? That answer lies in how Royal Lodge was managed over the last 2 decades, and why this arrangement was never as secure as it seemed. Here's the part most people missed. Royal Lodge wasn't just given to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, it was locked up in a long lease that was designed to look clean on paper and nearly impossible to unwind without consequences. One large upfront payment, a huge property, and a promise that the place would be maintained to a strict standard over time. Sounds simple until you realize that standard is where everything can snap. Because leases like this don't care who you are, they care what you return. And if inspectors believe the condition falls short, the exit terms flip instantly. Compensation stops being a reward and starts looking like a liability. That's why the inspection mattered more than the headlines. It didn't just describe damage, it created leverage. And the most interesting detail is what the estate didn't say publicly. When officials use careful phrases like dilapidations and consistent with the lease, they're not talking about peeling paint, they're pointing to obligations that may have been ignored for years. Which raises the uncomfortable question: if this was building up over time, why did nobody step in sooner? That's where the story gets sharper, because Royal Lodge isn't a normal private house. It's a historic property on a major royal estate, meaning the longer it declines, the more expensive it becomes to fix, and the more pressure builds behind the scenes to reclaim it. And once that pressure hits a tipping point, the palace doesn't argue in public, it moves in paperwork. And that leads to the next revelation. The fight isn't just about leaving, it's about when the keys are handed over and what happens the moment they are. Once the condition of Royal Lodge was no longer defensible, the focus quietly shifted from the property to the person. And this is where the king's role becomes impossible to ignore. There were limits to what could be done publicly, but behind the scenes, every remaining lever was pulled. Honours that could be removed were removed. Affiliations that still tied Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to royal life were severed, one by one. What makes this moment unusual isn't just the scale of the removals, it's the order. Each step came only after the estate issues were documented. That timing suggests the palace wasn't reacting emotionally, it was responding strategically, which raises a deeper question. Was this always the endgame once the inspection results were confirmed? Because once honours are gone, negotiation power disappears with them. Without status, there's no leverage to slow the process, and that's when relocation discussions stopped being optional. Plans were drawn up for a smaller residence, further from public view, and far easier to control. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. But here's the detail that keeps the situation unresolved. Despite all this, the lease still exists. On paper, it allows him to remain far longer than the palace would prefer, which creates a quiet standoff, not over whether he must leave, but how long he can realistically stay. And that brings us to the final pressure point, because every extra month inside Royal Lodge carries a cost, and that cost may be the one thing he can no longer afford. This is where the entire saga turns into a clock, not a dramatic one, a financial one. Because Royal Lodge isn't just a prestigious address, it's an expensive machine that never stops running. Heating, security, insurance, staff, basic upkeep. Every month the bill grows, even before major repairs are touched. And once the estate has documented serious deterioration, the cost of delay doesn't shrink, it escalates. That's why the timeline matters more than the rumors. Some reports point to an exit once alternative accommodation is ready, with late winter being the first realistic window. Others suggest the lease could allow a much longer stay on paper. But the real question is this: if compensation is now effectively gone, what incentive is left to hold on? Because staying longer doesn't strengthen his position, it weakens it. The estate can argue the condition is deteriorating further, repair estimates rise, public scrutiny increases, and the longer the keys aren't returned, the more this looks less like a slow transition and more like resistance. Then there's the quiet detail people overlook. Responsibility shifts the moment the keys change hands. Until then, the estate can document. After that, it can calculate, pursue, and rebuild. And the story stops being about status and starts being about accountability. Which makes one thing obvious: whoever controls the timing controls the narrative. So the end game is simple and brutal. Leave early and accept the loss, stay longer and watch the costs pile up while options narrow. And the final twist is this: the most damaging part of the inspection may not be what was found, but what might still be revealed once the estate does the full assessment after the doors finally open for good. This was never designed to explode into a headline-grabbing scandal. There were no dramatic announcements, no televised statements, no public confrontation. Instead, everything unfolded the way institutions prefer when they want something to end permanently, through records, inspections, and procedure. A name removed from registers, a residence deemed unreturnable, compensation quietly reduced to nothing. What makes this moment so striking is how deliberate it all feels. Each step followed the last with precision. First the inspection, then the findings, then the removal of honours, and finally the pressure to leave a property that once symbolized security and privilege, not as punishment, but as withdrawal. Support gone, status gone, leverage gone. And that may be the most revealing part of the story. There was no attempt to rehabilitate the situation, no effort to soften the outcome. Once the process began, it moved in only one direction, quietly, efficiently, and without room for reversal. When the keys to Royal Lodge are eventually handed back, the chapter won't end with outrage or sympathy. It will end with paperwork, repair estimates, and a cleared register. No spectacle, no redemption arc, just absence. Because in the modern monarchy, the most final consequence isn't public disgrace, it's being removed so completely that the institution no longer has to explain you at all.